I'm just going to read a short excerpt from it's from a book that's coming out in February, but it's part of a larger project because having worked in the same neighborhood in Tegucigalpa for just over 20 years, I've known families for that entire time, and so the persons who were infants when I first arrived there in the late 90s are now in their 20s, have kids of their own, and there's just a chain of stories from older brothers and sisters to younger brothers and sisters about crossing the border and listening to them over time. Um, I don't live on the border. I live in North Carolina, but I've spent some time down on the in Texas along the border. But it's been interesting to listen to their descriptions of it as it's been increasingly militarized and socially transformed. So this is an excerpt of well, this is from a kind of ethnographic snippet from 2007, and this person's younger sister. I have a following piece which takes place in 2018 in the context of the Trump administration separating families, etc. But I chose to work with this one for certain reasons. Um, my friend Victor and I walked up the hill. The unpaved streets of Los Piñares were mostly dark, with pools of light beneath the flickering street lamps. In the distance, we could see the twinkling lights of Tegucigalpa, but just ahead of us was a small crowd, at the center of which was Peri. He had been gone for months, and most hoped he'd never return. Peri had been abused by his alcoholic father and owned a pistol since he was 12 years old, when he first began discharging it in the air and clearing the neighborhood streets, standing there alone, shirtless, traumatized, and many suspected without much of a future to look forward to. The crowd parted as we walked up, and Peri was there, in baggy denim pants and a jacket, new white trainers, and a flat-brimmed hat. I had spoken with him only a few times in the past, and since he was usually drunk, I had no expectation he would remember me then. But I was wrong. He hugged Victor, and then he hugged me, asking when I arrived and how long I would stay. "When did you get here?" he asked. Just a few weeks ago." "I was in your country," he said. "I was in Texas. What a great place." I asked which parts he had seen. "Houston mostly, in the suburbs, where there are houses and more houses, everything looks the same, but the most expensive kind, with 2 levels, swimming pools. I lived in a house where there were a few Mexican families sharing everything to get by. I loved those areas. There was so much space. Around us, in Los Piñares, the barrio was extraordinarily cramped." Perry went on. "And when I was walking in the street anywhere in Texas, no one paid me any mind. I was like anyone else," he said. "Unlike here, where they see me coming and say, 'Here comes Perry, that piece of shit.'" As long as I had heard Perry's name, I had done everything possible to avoid him. He seemed unreachable, always intoxicated, the same long-barreled silver pistol in the waistline of his soiled jeans. After that night, as I rounded the corner each morning heading for the bus, I would hear a whistle from the top of the hill. Perry would be sitting outside his mother's house, waving me over. This was something new. He was shirtless, letting the sun cure his hangover. The same silver revolver he had owned since he was 12 beside him on the wooden table. His hands were covered in streaks and specks of glue that he had been sniffing during the night. Across his chest was a palimpsest of scars, some old, some new. As we sat and talked, his mother made coffee and sweetbread. "When we arrived in northern Mexico," he said, "we stayed on a ranch for 2 weeks. There were maybe 100 people there. The rooms were crowded and people were anxious. And then one morning they told a group of us to get into a bus, and we drove for like 9 hours, going east, I think. They told us we were in this tiny town called Santa Elena, right on the border. On the other side was a park, but we couldn't see it because it was dark and pure wilderness, like no lights, nothing. It's a park, like where the gringos go outside to sleep at night, right?" I realized that he was talking about Big Bend National Park. I said the name aloud, and his face lit up. "That's it," he exclaimed. "You know that place?" When I was 18, my best friend from high school and I drove cross-country from North Carolina. It was 1993, and Texas to us seemed like the other side of the world. When we got to Austin, some folks at the Broken Spoke told us about Big Bend National Park, and days later, we marveled as the silence in the park engulfed us with the sunset. Days after that, some other campers told us about the Mexican towns on the other side of the river and drew us a little map. There were two possibilities, Santa Elena and Boquillas. Don't go to Santa Elena, they said firmly. It's controlled by cartels. That was enough for us. We crossed the river in a small aluminum boat and paid a Mexican man who had a marijuana leaf embroidered on his leather vest a few dollars to get us there. We walked through some sand dunes and eventually into Boquillas. It was one street, a billiards hall, a couple of bars, and a church. An older gringo approached us as we were playing pool, and my friend left with him, returning a half hour later with a half ounce of brown marijuana. We looked at each other, shrugged, and then crossed back in the same little boat into the park. 15 years later, Perry brought me back there, but it had changed so much. He described to me the fencing, the border patrol trucks, and drones that cut through the silence of the desert. They had slept in the open just outside of Santa Elena, and then, he says, the next night we crossed the river and started walking. The guide knew where to go, so we hiked through the park until the sun came up, I think. After that, it wasn't long until we arrived at a house. An older gringo man led us inside and gave us food and water. We were in the middle of nowhere. He didn't talk much, but you could tell that he was a good person. But then the next day they put us in a big cargo truck and drove for hours. We arrived in Houston and the coyotes stopped the van and then just yelled at us, "Get out now." So we get out and there we are in a bus station. And all I knew was my friend Omar from La Uruquina in Tegucigalpa was supposed to meet me there. I saw him immediately. He was careful about me because he knows who I've been in the past. And he was driving me to the house when he started telling me, "Look, Perry, I met you here because you deserve a chance, but you only get one." He introduced me to his Mexican friends living in the house together. They worked at hotels and in construction, so I went with the men the next day and they started me on one of the construction sites. I knew how to mix cement since a long time ago, and they could see I was a hard worker. It was good for weeks. I was making money, sending it back to my mom, and then one day they saw my tattoos. On one arm, Perry had two long and slender clowns grinning and standing back to back with pistols in hand. On the other arm was a pentagram surrounded by thorned roses and the numbers 1 and 3 of the MS-13 and a spider web on his elbow. The train passengers would have recoiled on his way to the border. The tattoos marked him not only as a member of the MS-13, but as an international fugitive. I thought they would throw me out, he said. I swore to them that I was not active in gangs anymore, that all I wanted to do was live a clean life and send money to my mother. And when I was saying this, I started crying, and it was so humiliating. But they could see that I wasn't lying. And after that, they chose to believe me. I don't know if I'll see them again, but they were the first people to really trust me, the first people to really see who I think I am on the inside. At that moment, the donkey behind his mother's house brayed. "Being there changes everyone," he said, nodding. "What does? Being where?" I asked. "Living on the other side," he said. "Wherever they go. I mean, for me it was Texas, even if I never go back." And he never would. A few days later, Perry was standing in the doorway of his mother's house when a boy no older than 14 or 15 shot him 6 times at close range. There was no funeral, and within a week his mother vanished, abandoning the house and leaving no word where she was going. For days, flowers appeared on the bench where Perry had so often sat, but no one knew who was putting them there.